So a guy by the name of Daniel Levy, who's a founder of J Street, he goes on CNN and, man, he just rips like 14 pro-Israel narratives to shreds. This is actually a masterclass in deconstructing a whole bunch of bullshit that we're hearing. All the Netanyahu defenders, all the Israel defenders at this late date. Let's watch and we'll break it down. I think they regret bringing this guy on because he rips through them like nobody's business.
That international law is applied without distinction. Everyone is bound by international law. So this isn't about equivalence. It is about saying that a Palestinian people under belligerent permanent occupation has the right to resist, but that resistance must be conducted within the framework of international law. And the Israeli state has the right and indeed the duty to defend its citizens, to provide them with security, but that has to be conducted within the framework of international law. What Hamas did on October 7th apparently violated international law. It is therefore culpable in its leadership, in those who conducted and ordered this, to prosecution. What Israel has done subsequently, using starvation as a weapon of war, in how it has conducted itself in Gaza, is also culpable under international law. The ICC was also previously considering the crimes committed before October the 6th.
This is such a great point that he's making here. It's for everybody who's crying and whining and bitching and moaning about the ICC is doing a false equivalence between Israel and Hamas. He's like, no, they're not. They're doing their job. In other words, do Palestinians have a right to resist illegal occupation? Under international law, they do. But as he points out, you have to do that within the framework of international law. You can't violently attack innocent civilians. Now, they can attack military outlets. They absolutely can. There's an illegal occupation happening against them. So those are absolutely fair targets. Can't go after innocent civilians. So the ICC is like, hey, you violated some laws. We're going to go after the Hamas leaders. But at the same time, the response from Israel has been far above and beyond anything that even happened on October 7th. Israel's killed more civilians as a raw number and as a percentage. And so what he's saying is, international law also applies to you guys. You guys are absolutely, you've killed over 90% innocent civilians, attacked UN buildings and hospitals and schools. Your ass is facing a whole bunch of charges too. And that's exactly right. This is the law. This is how it works. This is how it functions. This is how it should function. And anybody who's not acknowledging this very basic fact is either really fucking dumb or they're just lying.
This isn't about equivalence. It's about law. And I think the US has a problem if its president does not understand that the law, whether internationally or nationally, has to be applied equally. Because one of the things, also I understand, he and his Democrat Party are running on, is that his opponent is a threat to the rule of law and democracy. But does the president himself understand what those things are if he makes these accusations?
Yeah, since you're talking about the U.S. response, I mean, they haven't changed their support for Israel. They called the decision wrong-headed, and the Biden administration might pursue sanctions against the ICC. What do you make of that?
You know, I don't see how this is supporting Israel. I really want to challenge this notion that encouraging Israel to break international law is somehow an act of friendship. I would say it's quite the reverse. I would say Israel has gotten itself into this predicament, partly because it has gotten used to the idea of impunity, the idea that whatever you do, you can get away with it because the US has your back. At the UN, at the ICC, at the ICJ, that the US can intimidate. Let's be it's the ICC. The idea that you can intimidate people into doing the wrong thing, into violating their own charters, is a terrible thing for the US to be doing at a time where international law and international institutions are fragile, at a time when US standing internationally needs that floating global South, global majority vote. You're undermining yourself at a time of the Ukraine-Russia crisis. You stand up for one thing in one instance, you undermine, cut it off at the knees in another, and you're encouraging Israel to do the very things that will not bring Israel security. Of course, these are devastating to the Palestinians, the images we see every day from Gaza, but this is also what got Israel to this place originally, and it encourages the overreach and the extremism.
Prime Minister Netanyahu calls these charges, both that and the charges from the International Court of Justice, or the efforts there to bring Israel to change their behavior. I guess he calls that the new anti-Semitism. I want to read just a few quotes from some Israeli columnists here. Gideon Levy wrote in Haaretz, "There is no joy in your prime minister and your country's defense minister about to become wanted all over the world, but it is impossible not to feel some satisfaction about the beginning of some doing of justice." And Noah Landau wrote, "If and when Netanyahu is called to the courtroom there, not for a moment will I feel that I am on trial as well. Anyone who feels himself accused of something should ask himself why." I'm wondering, how marginal are those types of views in Israel right now, do you think?
Look, sadly, your question is spot on, and those views are not mainstream. The entirety of at least the Zionist political spectrum has jumped to the defense of the prime minister, as if the problem is the consequences, as if the problem is being caught, not the act you are committing and being caught for. That's unfortunately a deep moral failing that needs to be discussed. Part of it is what you pointed out, what the prime minister is saying, because I think the cognitive map in people's heads is, well, this is easy. We know this is anti-Semitism. This is the world is against us. And it's a terrible direction to go in for many reasons. But one of them is when you trivialize the accusation of anti-Semitism, when it becomes meaningless, if everything is anti-Semitic, then nothing is, then you actually undermine the struggle, the very real struggle to secure Jewish communities, other minorities. It makes it harder to create a broad anti-racist coalition at a time when intolerance is on the rise. So this conflation, this misplaced accusation of anti-Semitism, I would argue is bad news for Jewish communities, in addition to all the bad things happening in the Middle East right now.
In other words, it's the boy who cried wolf. If you're going to call this anti-Semitism, upholding international law and going after an obvious war criminal, if that's anti-Semitism, you've taken all the meaning away from anti-Semitism. And next time there's actual anti-Semitism and people call it out, they'll be like, oh yeah, just like the last time you guys said it was anti-Semitic because there were some pro-Palestine protesters on a college campus who didn't want to carpet bomb babies. They're making their bed, man. They're making their bed. There's no doubt about it. This guy dropped some knowledge. I also love the point how he said, is it actually pro-Israel what the U.S. is doing? Sending endless money and endless weapons to Israel, sitting there and green lighting their brazen and rampant and wanton extremism, bombing Rafah, bombing refugee camps, killing massive numbers of innocent civilians when they say it was to get one or two Hamas people. Is that really pro-Israel? Because what can happen in this scenario? What can happen is they keep doing it, they keep overreaching, they keep killing innocent people. Not only do you have the ICC and the ICJ going after them, but they become more and more isolated on the international stage. And the more isolated they are, the more likely it is that countries cut off all economic ties with them. When they get enough countries to cut off economic ties with them, then you're looking at an economic depression. You're looking at an economic depression, then it's like, well, we have to sort of reverse course in one way or another just to stay afloat as a country, right? And it can get to the point where they've become such a pariah state that they're on the verge of collapse, just like apartheid South Africa, right? And that, I mean, look, that might be an end result here. That might be an end result here. That might actually happen. And that's the point that this guy's making. He's like, yeah, Biden and, all these people who support this, they might think it's being pro-Israel, but it might ultimately lead to the absolute destruction of Israel. And so maybe you should rethink whether or not really is pro the country to let them commit a genocide and cheer them on along the way and arm them and fund them. So this was great. Now, by the way, I believe this guy was one of the founders of J Street, and J Street has actually been pretty horrible throughout this whole thing. They have. So AIPAC, we all know how horrendous AIPAC is. J Street's supposed to be like the liberal Zionist organization, but in many ways they acted very, very conservative and right-wing in this. And funny enough, he makes that point too when he's asked about how mainstream is this thought in Israel, Netanyahu's actually guilty. And he's like, look, it's not common at all. The liberal Zionists are circling the wagons and they're defending Netanyahu. And it's like, yeah, well, that's a problem with liberal Zionism, right? It's not an argument, oh, you shouldn't charge Netanyahu because the liberal Zionists are turning on you. No, it just goes to show you there's only so far left you can go. There's only so liberal you can be within the context of an ethno-state and a theocracy, right? And that's a fatal flaw within that country itself. Just like with apartheid South Africa. Oh, I'm a liberal believer in apartheid South Africa. It's like, that's not really a thing. Now is it? And this moment is sort of exposing that. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.